Before the great upheaval we now call the French Revolution, France operated under a system known as the Ancien Régime. This simply means the old rule or old order. Imagine a society structured like a rigid pyramid, where your place was largely decided by birth, not by your talent or hard work. At the very top, of course, sat the king, who was believed to rule by divine right. That is, his authority came directly from God, or so it was claimed. This system had been in place for centuries, but by the late 1700s, serious cracks were beginning to show, and many people were deeply unhappy with how things were run. It was a world ripe for change. This pyramid of society was formally divided into 3 estates. The first estate was the clergy, which included everyone from wealthy bishops and abbots, living in grand style, down to humble village priests. The church was incredibly powerful in Old France. It owned vast amounts of land, perhaps as much as 10% of the entire country. Crucially, the church paid very few taxes to the state, despite its considerable wealth. Instead, it collected its own tax, the tithe, from the peasants. You can see how this might not sit well with those struggling to make ends meet, can't you? This exemption from financial contribution was a major source of simmering resentment. Next came the second estate, the nobility. These were the aristocrats, the dukes, counts, barons, and so on, many of whom could trace their lineage back for generations. Like the clergy, the nobility enjoyed significant privileges. They owned a huge chunk of the land, often around 25%, and they too were exempt from paying many of the most burdensome taxes, such as the main land tax, the. Nobles also held traditional feudal rights over the peasants living on their lands, which could include demanding labor or dues. For many, this seemed like an unfair relic of a bygone age, especially as some nobles lived lives of incredible luxury. Finally, we come to the third estate, and this is where things get really interesting, because the third estate was, quite simply, everyone else. It made up around 97% of the French population. This vast group included a wide range of people, wealthy merchants, doctors, and lawyers, often called the bourgeoisie, as well as urban workers, artisans, and the great mass of peasants who toiled in the countryside. Despite their numbers and their vital contribution to the French economy, they had precious few rights and shouldered almost the entire tax burden. They paid the tithe to the church, salt tax, and many other duties, leaving them with little to live on. It was a recipe for discontent. So, what pushed this deeply divided society over the edge? Well, one of the most pressing issues was money, or rather the lack of it in the royal coffers. The French state was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Decades of expensive wars, including France's crucial support for the American Revolution against Britain, had drained the treasury. Added to this was the lavish spending of the royal court, which, while perhaps not the biggest drain, certainly looked bad to ordinary folk. To make matters worse, a series of poor harvests in the 1780s led to a severe shortage of grain. This meant the price of bread, the staple food for most French people, skyrocketed, leading to widespread hunger and desperation. Alongside these economic hardships, powerful new ideas were taking root. This was the Age of Enlightenment, a period when thinkers and writers championed reason, individual rights, and challenged old traditions. Philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote about the social contract, the idea that government should be based on the will of the people. Voltaire, another prominent figure, attacked religious intolerance and the abuses of the powerful. These ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity began to circulate widely through pamphlets, books, and discussions in salons and coffee houses. They encouraged people to question the divine right of kings and the privileges of the aristocracy. It was a powerful intellectual current. At the head of this troubled nation was King Louis XVI. He had inherited the throne in 1774, and by all accounts was a well-meaning man. He wasn't deliberately cruel or tyrannical, unlike some historical rulers. However, he was also known for his indecisiveness and lack of strong leadership qualities. He often seemed overwhelmed by the scale of the problems facing France and struggled to push through necessary financial reforms, often backing down in the face of opposition from powerful nobles. In many ways, he was simply not the right sort of king for such a critical time. He preferred hunting and locksmithing to the hard graft of statecraft, which didn't help his image. And then there was his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. She was an Austrian princess, and her foreign origins made her an object of suspicion and dislike from the moment she arrived in France. She became a symbol of the court's perceived extravagance and detachment. Stories, often exaggerated or entirely false, circulated about her lavish spending on clothes, jewels, and elaborate hairstyles, while ordinary people starved. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," supposedly her response to hearing the poor had no bread, was almost certainly never uttered by her. But the fact that people believed it shows just how unpopular she had become, a convenient scapegoat for the nation's ills. The Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris, was more than just a royal residence. It was a dazzling symbol of the French monarchy's absolute power and immense wealth. Built by Louis XIV, the Sun King, it was a world of its own, filled with gilded halls, vast gardens, and elaborate courtly rituals. Thousands of nobles lived or congregated there, vying for royal favor. This magnificent palace, however, also represented the monarchy's isolation from the everyday struggles of the French people. While Parisians were facing hunger and hardship, the court at Versailles often seemed to exist in a bubble of luxury and intrigue, further fueling popular resentment against the ruling class. It was a physical manifestation of the gap between the privileged few and the struggling masses. The simmering discontent finally boiled over in the summer of 1789. King Louis XVI, facing a financial crisis, had reluctantly called a meeting of the Estates General, an assembly representing all three estates for the first time since 1614. The Third Estate, however, quickly grew frustrated with the unfair voting system, where each estate had one vote, meaning the privileged First and Second Estates could always outvote them. They broke away, declared themselves the National Assembly, and in a famous moment known as the Tennis Court Oath, vowed not to disband until France had a new constitution. This was a direct challenge to the king's authority, a bold step towards revolution. The tension in Paris reached fever pitch in July. Rumors spread that the king was gathering troops to crush the new National Assembly. On July 14, 1789, a large crowd of Parisians, desperate for gunpowder and weapons to defend themselves, marched on the Bastille. The Bastille was a medieval fortress in the heart of Paris, used as a state prison. Though it held only a handful of prisoners at the time, it stood as a grim symbol of royal despotism and arbitrary power. After several hours of fighting, during which the governor was killed, the crowd successfully stormed and captured the fortress. This event was a shockwave. The fall of the Bastille was an event of immense symbolic importance. It wasn't just about freeing a few prisoners or seizing weapons. It was about the people rising up and dismantling a potent emblem of the old regime's oppression. The news spread like wildfire throughout France and beyond, signaling that the power of the monarchy could be challenged by popular action. It marked a decisive moment when the revolution turned from political maneuvering to direct, violent confrontation. That is why, even today, the 14th of July, Bastille Day, is celebrated as France's national holiday, a commemoration of the people's victory over tyranny. In the immediate aftermath of the Bastille's fall, the revolution gathered pace. The National Assembly moved quickly to dismantle the Ancien Régime. In August 1789, it issued the August Decrees, which abolished feudalism, noble privileges, and the church's right to collect tithes. This was a fundamental reshaping of French society. Shortly thereafter, the Assembly proclaimed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This landmark document, inspired by Enlightenment ideals, declared that all men were born free and equal in rights, proclaimed rights to liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It was a bold statement that would inspire people for generations to come. However, the path of revolution is rarely smooth. As the revolutionaries sought to create a new France, divisions emerged, and the situation became increasingly radicalized. The period from 1793 to 1794 is known as the Reign of Terror. Dominated by Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, this phase saw extreme measures taken to protect the revolution from its perceived enemies, both internal and external. Thousands of people, including many former revolutionaries, were accused of treason or counter-revolutionary activities and swiftly sent to the guillotine. It was a brutal and bloody chapter, a stark reminder of how revolutions can consume their own. The king and queen, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, did not escape the revolution's wrath. After a failed attempt to flee France in 1791, known as the Flight to Varennes, Any remaining trust in the monarchy evaporated. They were imprisoned, and in late 1792, the monarchy was formally abolished, and France was declared a republic. Louis XVI was put on trial, found guilty of treason, and executed by guillotine in January 1793. Marie Antoinette met the same fate 9 months later, in October 1793. The executions of the king and queen sent shockwaves across Europe, signaling a definitive end to centuries of Bourbon rule in France and a radical departure from traditional forms of government. The French Revolution had profound and lasting effects, not just for France but for the entire world. It championed the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which spread across Europe and beyond, inspiring other movements for reform and independence. Although the revolutionary period itself was marked by instability and violence, eventually leading to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, its core principles endured. It laid the groundwork for modern democratic societies, the concept of human rights, and the rise of nationalism. The French Revolution demonstrated that ordinary people could overturn an established order and strive to create a society based on new, more equitable principles, a legacy that continues to resonate powerfully today.